Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
I kept smiling while my brother told the room that I should hand him my struggling business, and the sound of laughter around the table hit me like a polite slap. The place smelled of money and old whiskey, of people who have never been wrong long enough to learn anything. Ethan stood at the head of the long mahogany table, face lit by the golden glow of the chandelier, enjoying the applause he didn't have to earn anymore. Dad sat near him, laughing the loudest, his hand pounding the table, red in the face with pride and bourbon. Mom gave me that quiet, pleading look she always gives when she wants me to ignore cruelty for the sake of family peace. I did what I always do when surrounded by people who mistake humiliation for humor. I smiled as if it didn't sting. It was Ethan's big night. Vice President of Operations at Harbor and Way Consulting. The title sounded impressive until you saw the spreadsheets behind it. Same clients, same problems, different letterhead. The firm had been bleeding cash for months, but in our family, appearances matter more than math. Ethan had the kind of charm that fills in balance sheets with confidence. I had spreadsheets that scared bankers into respect. And still, somehow, I was the disappointment, the sister who left college halfway through her degree to start something silly. That something silly now employed 40 people and handled more data than half the firms Ethan bragged about. But to them, I was still the dropout who didn't finish what she started. He raised his glass and smiled, that performative smile that always worked for him, the one that made donors, clients, and girlfriends believe he was the center of gravity. "I'm grateful tonight," he began, "for my team, for my mentors, and for my family. Even my sister Ava," he said, pausing long enough for the laughter to warm up. "She's out there running her little startup, you know, the one that keeps surviving off caffeine and stubbornness. Maybe one day, when she's ready to quit pretending, she'll let me take over and fix it for her." The table erupted. Even Mom laughed softly, though her eyes begged me not to respond. Dad wiped a tear of laughter from his cheek. "That's my boy," he said. "Always thinking like a leader." It was supposed to be affectionate, but it landed like a hammer. I took a sip of my water, and the glass shook slightly in my hand. I told myself it was just the air conditioning. What they didn't know was that my phone, inside my clutch, had already buzzed twice. The message waiting there was one I had scheduled weeks earlier, the kind of message that ends conversations before they begin. I didn't look at it yet. I preferred to let the irony ripen. I waited for Ethan to finish his toast, thanking the visionaries who made his promotion possible, and when he finally sat down, basking in approval, I raised my own glass. "To you, Ethan," I said, steady and clear. "May you get everything you've earned." He smirked, hearing flattery, not the blade behind it. Dinner went on. There were steaks, expensive wine, small talk about golf trips and interest rates. I kept smiling, kept nodding, kept pretending that I wasn't counting every passing second like a chess clock. My mother talked about family vacations we never took. My father bragged about a deal he didn't actually close. Ethan made jokes about startups that don't start up. They all laughed. I memorized the rhythm of it, the sound of people so secure in their hierarchy that they didn't notice it shifting beneath them. When dessert arrived, some over-decorated cake that looked better than it tasted, I excused myself and walked out to the balcony overlooking the golf course. The night air was cold and sharp. The kind of air that makes you see things clearly. The reflection in the glass showed me a woman who looked calm but felt like a fault line. I thought about the last 2 years, about the sleepless nights, the empty bank account that became a company account, the pitch meetings that ended in no, the one that finally said yes, and the quiet investors who understood leverage better than my family ever would. I heard Ethan's laugh behind me, still echoing from the dining room. "Come on, Ava," he called through the open door. "Don't be mad. It's a joke." I turned back and smiled. "I know," I said softly. "It's your kind of joke." He winked and raised his glass again, already turning away before I could finish the sentence. That's what he did: start things, let someone else finish them. When the evening finally ended and coats were being handed out, I hugged Mom first. She whispered, "You handled that beautifully." I told her I was fine. Dad pulled me in for a hug and patted my back like he was burping an infant. You'll get your turn someday, he said, which was his favorite way of ending conversations that didn't involve him. I smiled again and nodded, slipping a small cream envelope into Ethan's coat pocket as he laughed with a client near the exit. On the envelope, embossed in gold, were the words, "Return to sender." The valet pulled up Ethan's car first. He turned to me, one hand on the door. "No hard feelings, right?" he said, still in that smirking tone that made me wish I'd chosen a different bloodline. "Of course not," I said. "You were hilarious." He grinned, satisfied with the performance, and drove off. I waited until the taillights disappeared, then walked to my own car in silence. The drive home was quiet except for the sound of my turn signal clicking through the dark. I passed my company's modest office building, a narrow structure downtown, lights still on because I had people who actually worked through the night. I parked, unlocked my phone, and finally opened the message that had been waiting since dinner. Subject: Change of control executed. Body: effective immediately. Northline Analytics acquires Harbor and Way Consulting. The file attached was short, cold, and perfect. I leaned back in my seat and exhaled. Somewhere across the city, my brother was probably posting his promotion photos online, smiling under the caption "Dreams Achieved." He had no idea that by morning, his dream would belong to someone else. I didn't laugh. I didn't even smile. I just whispered the same 2 words printed on the card I'd left in his pocket. Return to sender. I woke before the first gray seam of morning had split the horizon and sat in the driver's seat outside Harbor and Way's building with the engine off, the windows fogged just enough to make the lobby lights look like distant buoys in a cold harbor. And while the city stretched and yawned itself awake, I unwrapped a plain bagel, chewed slowly, and considered the peculiar calm that arrives when a fight you have already won still looks, to everyone else, unwinnable. By the time the press release queued at dawn reached the inboxes that mattered, the marble atrium had begun to echo with careful footsteps and the subdued clatter of early risers who had convinced themselves that showing up before sunrise was the same thing as being indispensable. And I felt an unexpected tenderness for the analysts and coordinators and office managers who propped up the men who spoke in bullet points, because I had built my company on the certainty that people who do the quiet work deserve better than being told their effort is only a slide in someone else's deck. At the exact moment the announcement posted, the screen on my dashboard brightened with a synchronized strobe of messages. The first from my CFO confirming filings had propagated to the wire services, the next from a reporter asking for a quote about strategic alignment, and then, stacked beneath them like impatient jurors, the family thread in which Dad demanded clarification in a tone that sounded less like a father seeking understanding and more like a foreman questioning a late delivery. Ethan deployed 3 question marks and 2 half-formed threats, and Mom asked, without punctuation, if I was safe and if I would please drink water, and I chose, with a discipline that felt like mercy, to answer none of them yet. I carried 2 paper bags of still-warm bagels past security, nodded to the guard who read my newly activated badge without surprise because professional people understand that surprises rarely happen at random, and greeted Priya at reception by name, which made her blink and then grin and then visibly lower her shoulders as if someone had finally turned off an alarm only she could hear, and when I asked if she would help me gather the early arrivals for a quick welcome, she said yes with the eager relief of a person who suspects the new regime might be organized enough to mean what it says. We stood in the atrium beneath a brass clock that had always been 5 minutes fast, a detail I kept because it telegraphed urgency to the right minds, and I told them that their clients remain their clients, their titles remain their titles, that a retention plan would land in their inboxes before the end of the hour with numbers written in words and clauses written without traps, and that the vending machine would lose the stale chips and gain the good chocolate because details are not decoration but proof of intention, and I watched the room exhale as if someone had opened a window in a house that had been shut too long. I had already scheduled the guest network to rename itself Return to Sender at first light, a small, almost silly flourish that carried the precise voltage of a boundary without tipping into cruelty. And when Priya noticed the change on her screen, she laughed in the soft, involuntary way that signals to everyone nearby that perhaps the sky is not falling this morning after all. Ethan arrived in the momentum of a sitcom entrance, without the applause track, jaw set, tie slightly askew, eyes scanning for a camera that would give him back his spotlight. And when he saw me standing with a spiral-bound transition workbook tucked under my arm like a teacher calling roll, he aimed for a private confrontation but discovered, as we stepped into the elevator together, that privacy is not a right granted to men who turn humiliation into party games, so I let the doors close and listened to his opening argument about boards and votes and the sanctity of legacy while the floor numbers ticked upward. And when he demanded to meet in his office, I said we would meet in mine, and then led him to the glass-walled corner space I had relabeled with a temporary plaque that read, Head of Client Transitions, a title that sounded, if you squinted, like prestige but functioned, in practice, like a penance with a paycheck. He laughed once, short and bright like a match, and said he would not do it, that he would call the banker Dad always name-dropped at Thanksgiving. And I told him he should absolutely make that call because the banker had already texted me for a meeting, and we would all be more comfortable if everyone used their real names when discussing their real leverage. Before 9, I met finance, legal, and the operations lead who had been holding the entire vendor universe together with color-coded spreadsheets and patience. And I asked the questions that matter when you inherit a machine with parts that still move but oil that smells scorched, and I heard the truth I expected about receivables that smiled from afar and frowned up close, about a side letter that had been treated like a handkerchief when it was, in fact, a tripwire, and about a pending contractor suit that had been filed by a man who kept every email like a rosary and had attached them in order. Each answer slotted into the architecture we had already built, not to make a public spectacle, but to prevent a quiet implosion that would have taken good people's mortgages down with it. And though Ethan paced the hallway as if he could frighten the numbers into obedience, the numbers, being indifferent to swagger, sat exactly where we had found them. When the banker finally arrived, perfectly shaved and aggressively courteous, he suggested we slow-walk integration, keep titles ceremonial, restore appearances so that no one lost face, and he insisted, with the confidence of a man who has mistaken precedent for law, that covenants are guidelines interpreted among gentlemen, and I explained, with the patience I reserve for people who think clever is the same thing as correct, that the cash threshold was not a rumor, that the vendor delays were not rounding errors, and that if he truly cared about stability, he would appreciate a plan that paid every small supplier on time and preserved every job that produced real value, and he left with the promise to call me after touching base with his credit team, which I translated as a long walk down a short hallway. Ethan demanded to know what I had promised and what I had threatened, and I told him I had offered accountability and declined theater, and because he needed a tangible humiliation to rage against, I canceled his executive car service and reassigned his reserved parking space to Denise from payroll, a single mother who had been arriving before sunrise and leaving after sunset. And I sent a short note to facilities to stencil the spot with her name by tomorrow morning, not because trophies change hearts, but because visible fairness steadies a building faster than speeches. By late morning, the building had adopted the rhythm of a new weather system, light pouring across glass and steel, conversations conducted in the key of cautious optimism. And while Ethan leaned against the chrome coffee machine and tried to manufacture a rebellion from fragments of old loyalties, the staff did what smart staff always do when they recognize that a storm has passed without breaking the windows, which is to return to their work with sharper focus, because people cling to competence the way sailors cling to masts. I was about to exhale when my phone lit with a name I had avoided reading out loud for years, a name that belonged to a very precise attorney who only called when someone with reach had decided to stop pretending and start pulling, and as the ring continued, patient and relentless, I felt that thin strand of anticipation tighten in my chest, the one that tells you the next move has already been set in motion by hands you cannot see, and I answered with my voice steady, my back straight, and my promise to myself unbroken. fully aware that whatever this call contained would decide whether today ended as a coronation, a street fight, or the first chapter of a longer war I had always known I would have to win twice. The attorney's voice came through calm and practiced, the kind of calm that grows on people who spend their days untangling knots others pretend are ribbons, and while he introduced himself with the precision of a surgeon reading a chart, I stared across the atrium at Ethan pacing before the glass office, phone to his ear, eyes flicking toward me as if outrage could cross a room and rearrange a contract, and I felt the old childhood reflex of picking up the pieces after he knocked over the game. Bored, even as another reflex, one I had taught myself over the last few years, insisted that I let the pieces stay exactly where they had fallen because geometry is a better teacher than nostalgia. The attorney laid out, without drama and without delay, the items he expected Dad and the family's favorite banker to raise, a plea for stability, dressed up as a challenge to the timing of our change of control. A suggestion that covenants can be treated like suggestions when gentlemen not in the right room, and a threat to whisper to a reporter about a supposed poison pill tucked into some imaginary appendix, and I thanked him. Not because I needed the warning, but because I like to hear a professional confirm that what I smelled in the wind was not rain but smoke from someone else's brush fire. He asked whether we were prepared to show receipts, and I said we had built our case on nothing else, because I do not enjoy revenge if the ledger cannot sing its explanation aloud. I walked him through the sequence we had assembled over many nights that bled into mornings, a sequence that was simple enough to be dull on paper and therefore strong enough to hold in court, beginning with receivables that looked glossy from the top line but, when laid flat, revealed a cluster of invoices aging into that brittle zone where optimistic finance teams write cheerful notes and vendors begin praying over dinner, then a side letter with a supplier that did not look illegal because it had been dressed in careful language, but that functioned like a date shifter for costs that did not belong in the quarter where they had been gently relocated. Then a cash-on-hand covenant written with the clarity of a grandmother's recipe and ignored with the casual confidence of men who assume the family name will cover the overdraft, and finally a pending suit from a contractor who had saved everything, including the message where a mid-level manager told him to bury hours in a week that did not exist. We had purchased the relevant paper from the lender without fanfare, had made conservative assumptions about risk, because I prefer to be bored by probability rather than surprised by calamity, and had entered into a contingency agreement that triggered when the covenant finally broke in the exact way the spreadsheets had predicted, which meant we did not push the building over. We simply installed better handrails and watched, with some sadness, as the old ones failed the weight test they were always going to fail. Noah arrived with a blue folder tabbed in a way that would have delighted any auditor, and he slid into the chair as if he had been sitting there for hours already, which in a sense he had, given how long we had been bracing for this moment. And he pointed to 3 items the attorney should expect to be poked: the internal memo that treated slow vendor payments as a liquidity management strategy, the email thread where a project lead wrote that the aging report was cosmetic until quarter close, and the calendar invite from the very banker Dad intended to summon, which suggested, in such delicate phrasing that I almost admired it, that if a line could be painted gray no one would notice where it had been white. The attorney asked, in that soft legal way that always sounds like a polite dare, whether I had any risk tied to my Dropout chapter that would make good theater for a hostile narrative, and I said that the only story there was the one I would, at some point, tell myself, a scholarship check that vanished into a family emergency the year a doctor explained the price tag on breathing, a dean who said to take a leave and come back on a timeline that never arrived, a decision to work 2 jobs and build one improbable idea with the help of an investor who did not care about diplomas so long as the numbers landed on time. By noon I had the banker back in my conference room pretending to be magnanimous, offering to help restore appearances if I would slow the integration and let Ethan keep a ceremonial stripe, and I laid out a plain plan in plain words, promising nothing except what I could fund and refusing everything except what the staff deserved, and when he hinted at a rumor he might cede if I did not bend, I smiled in that tired way that women learn to use when a man assumes leverage is a synonym for gravity. then handed him the packet of vendor payment schedules signed by me and countersigned by Noah with dates written out in words, so that even a careless reader would grasp that small suppliers would not be squeezed to prop up large egos. Ethan, hearing that the door had shut on the possibility of simple face saving, accused me of humiliation for sport, and I told him that sport was loud and sweaty and full of whistles, whereas what I was doing was accounting, which is quiet, relentless, and allergic to applause. In the afternoon, facilities sent me a photo of the parking space now stenciled with Denise's name in crisp white letters, and beneath it, the note I had asked them to add in smaller script. A single word that carried exactly the tone I wanted ringing in the concrete: priorities, and I printed the photo and slid it into the sleeve of Ethan's transition binder so that he would see it when he reached for the talking points he never used. Not as a taunt, but as a compass that refused to look away. I authorized the downgrade of his corporate card to the same limit as every manager, which meant he could still buy lunch for a team, but could no longer host dinners that required a sommelier and a speech. And I rerouted his signature authority to require a second approval, not because I do not trust him to sign, but because I do not trust him to read before he does. Late in the day, Noah tapped the conference room glass with the knuckle of a man who has just found the paragraph everyone pretended did not exist, a note in the banker's email that crossed courtesy into coordination with a client's procurement head. A tiny arrangement that might not be illegal, but certainly would look unpleasant in the right light, and as the sun angled into a harsh stripe across the table, I felt the decision land with the clarity of a pistol shot muffled by distance, because ambiguity is a luxury I stopped buying when I learned what invoices feel like against the ribs, and I drafted the sentence that would, if sent, dump the conversation into the bank's compliance channel with a timestamp and a copy to counsel. And I held my finger over the send button for one deliberate breath while Ethan, somewhere 2 floors down, gathered allies around a coffee machine that had been refilled with beans from a vendor we had paid before close of business. The moment the banker left, still carrying the weight of his own discomfort like a portfolio he couldn't rebalance, I knew the silence he left behind was not a pause but a fuse. There is a very specific stillness that descends right before a backlash, when people who have lost control try to remember how to fake dignity, and that quiet is where most mistakes are born. Ethan disappeared into meetings that did not exist, calls that no one answered, and corridors where reflection in glass seemed to offend him. I gave him space not because I owed him peace, but because men like him mistake silence for weakness, and it's useful to let them build their illusions with both hands before you light the match. By afternoon, the calls started arriving in waves, each one more desperate to sound composed than the last. Dad began with small talk about family dinners, trying to disguise interrogation as nostalgia, asking how my little operation was holding up under the weight of so much responsibility. He said it the way someone compliments a child for tying their own shoes, and for a moment I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because repetition has a way of becoming parody. I let him talk until he reached the point he was circling toward. The banker had called him, not with panic but with persuasion, suggesting that a temporary restructuring might be best for everyone. Dad pretended to find the idea noble. I knew it for what it was, a soft coup disguised as a compromise, a way to pry the company back into the old family orbit by appealing to sentiment instead of legality. He mentioned that Ethan had suffered enough embarrassment, that investors were worried about perception, and that I could prove myself as the mature one by showing flexibility. His words were clean, but underneath them pulsed a threat wrapped in fatherly advice. I listened until his breath slowed, then said with a calmness I didn't have to fake that I would never confuse flexibility with surrender. He chuckled the way men chuckle when they believe patience is a kind of weapon. "You always were stubborn," he said. "It's in the blood." And I told him gently that if it was, then he should have known I'd never bleed quietly. That evening, I called Noah back into the conference room and asked him to pull up the compliance thread we'd been holding. The email Ethan's banker had sent contained a single line that transformed from clever to catastrophic under fluorescent light, a suggestion of coordination between the bank and a client procurement officer, timed suspiciously close to the firm's financial wobble. In corporate language, it was an innocent overlap. In real language, it was the kind of thing regulators salivate over. Noah sat across from me, his face lit blue by the screen, waiting for me to decide whether to use it. The choice wasn't between morality and revenge, it was between clarity and survival. There's a point in every confrontation where truth stops being an ideal and becomes an instrument. I pressed send. By morning, the compliance department had acknowledged receipt, copying legal teams with signatures long enough to fill a paragraph. That was the point of no return. Ethan arrived an hour later, dressed sharper than usual, which is how he telegraphed panic, and stormed into my office with Dad on speakerphone. Their strategy was predictable: loudness and legacy. Dad opened with a sermon about loyalty, Ethan followed with an accusation about betrayal, and both seemed unaware that the longer they spoke, the clearer they made my case. I let them shout until the echoes dulled, then handed Ethan a printed memo titled Conflict of Interest Disclosures and Retention Adjustments. His name appeared halfway down the page, attached to a suspension pending review. He went silent, not out of respect, but because silence was all that remained when noise no longer worked. Dad began another round of bluster until I interrupted, explaining that if the family wished to distance itself from scandal, it would be better served by thanking me for handling it quietly. That word, quietly, stopped him. He understood it as a promise and a warning at once. When the call ended, Ethan stood there for a long time, as if waiting for the air itself to argue on his behalf. I told him he could stay on the payroll while the investigation ran its course, but he would not enter a boardroom, touch a client file, or use the company card until cleared. He left without another word. Noah watched him go and asked if I felt relief. I didn't. Victory isn't relief. It's a form of exhaustion that arrives disguised as stillness. I walked to the window and looked down at the parking lot where Denise's new space gleamed in the sunlight like a small, precise correction to the chaos. Inside the building, the atmosphere had changed in ways that were subtle but irreversible. Emails came without defensiveness, hallway conversations softened, and for the first time, decisions were being made without the shadow of old egos leaning over the table. That night, I stayed late in the office, watching the city light itself in ribbons of gold and glass. I thought about the years spent being the quiet one at family dinners, the one who learned to survive by turning indignities into blueprints. Every piece of data I'd ever memorized, every investor I'd courted, every sleepless night I'd spent recalculating debt schedules, all of it had led to this moment where silence itself had become my loudest argument. Yet underneath the satisfaction, something colder stirred, a sense that I had won a game whose board was still expanding beyond sight. Power rearranges itself faster than truth, and I knew better than to assume this was over. When I finally shut down my computer, the only light left in the building came from the phone on my desk, pulsing faintly with a new message from an unknown number. It contained just 2 words: "We're watching." No signature, no punctuation. I stared at it for a long time, weighing whether it was a bluff, a threat, or something stranger, a reminder that every victory leaves a shadow, and sometimes the shadow belongs to someone who helped you win. The day I chose to meet Ethan again, I did it in the same place where the entire spectacle had begun, under the same chandelier that had cast its golden glow on my humiliation, at the same table where my father had laughed too loudly, and where my mother's silence had rung like a cracked bell. The restaurant manager, recognizing my name on the reservation, had greeted me with the stiff politeness reserved for customers who are either powerful or dangerous, and though I had never particularly enjoyed being either, I had learned that sometimes survival requires performing both roles with conviction. I arrived early, not out of sentiment but strategy. I wanted the space to remember who I had been before it saw who I had become. The tablecloth was still the same shade of cream, the glasses just as thin, and the view of the lake just as falsely serene, but what had changed was the gravitational pull of the evening itself. The first time I'd sat here, power had belonged to everyone but me. Now it hung invisible in the air between the silverware, waiting to see who would claim it first. Ethan walked in 20 minutes late, his tie knotted carelessly, his expression composed with the kind of effort that makes defeat visible even before words arrive. Behind him trailed our father, slower now, the confidence that used to fill his shoulders replaced by something smaller, more brittle, like an old general wearing a uniform that no longer fits. I gestured to the chairs opposite me. The waiter poured water, retreating with the intuition of someone who understood that this table was not for pleasantries. For a moment, none of us spoke, and in that silence, I heard the faint hum of the chandelier above, as though even the light was listening. "I suppose congratulations are in order," Ethan said finally, his voice a careful blend of irony and bitterness. "You've done well for yourself." I looked at him, studying the lines of fatigue that now framed his eyes, and wondered whether he realized that every sleepless night he was enduring now was one I had already lived years ago, without applause, without backup, without anyone thinking I'd make it past the first quarter. "It was never about doing well," I said slowly. "It was about surviving long enough to not need your approval." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You really think this is victory?" he asked. "You've burned every bridge you had." I leaned forward slightly, not with aggression, but with the calm of someone who has already measured the distance between anger and control. "No," I said. "I just stopped pretending the bridges were worth crossing." Dad shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat as if to remind us that he was still there, still the patriarch who once believed his word could settle any storm. "This family doesn't need to be at war," he began, his tone soft, but heavy with the weight of practiced authority. "We've all made mistakes. Ethan was careless, yes, but you've gone too far. You embarrassed him, and by extension, me. That's not strength, Ava, that's cruelty." I looked at him and felt the same detachment one feels watching an old film, recognizing every frame, but feeling none of it. "You call it cruelty because it came from me," I said quietly. "When it came from you, you called it guidance." His face tightened, the kind of controlled anger that trembles beneath decorum. "You've always been dramatic," he muttered, and I almost smiled, because for men like him, truth always sounds theatrical when it refuses to flatter them. I opened the folder I'd placed on the table and slid 2 documents toward Ethan. The first was a formal settlement outlining his options. He could remain in a reduced role under my leadership, keeping his salary and benefits, but surrendering decision-making authority. Or he could walk away with a severance generous enough to guarantee his comfort, paired with a 5-year non-compete clause. The second document was a clean resignation letter, already formatted with the date and his name. "These are your terms," I said. "They're fair. They're final." He stared at the papers without touching them, his throat tightening in that quiet way men try to disguise from themselves. "You're enjoying this," he said finally, his voice low. I shook my head. "You keep assuming this is about you." It never was. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he picked up the pen, signed the resignation, and slid it back across the table. "You always wanted to prove you were smarter than me," he said, his tone oddly detached. "Now you have." I met his eyes and felt no triumph, only an exhausted kind of peace that arrives when you finally stop running from ghosts. "I never wanted to be smarter," I said. "I just wanted to be heard." He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked away without looking back. Dad started to follow but paused beside me, his voice low and uncertain. "You've made your point," he said. "But what now?" I folded the papers neatly, placed them back in the folder, and stood. "Now," I said, "I stopped proving things to people who were never listening." I walked past him toward the exit, past the same spot on the balcony where I had once stood swallowing humiliation, and when I stepped outside, the air was colder than I expected, sharp against my lungs, alive with the kind of clarity that comes only after endings that were necessary. By the time I reached my car, my phone buzzed, a single message from an unknown number. It read, "Debt paid. We're even." I stared at it, feeling something shift just beneath comprehension, like the faint vibration of an unseen train passing underground. I didn't know who had sent it, perhaps the investor who had helped fund the acquisition, perhaps someone tied to the bank, perhaps even Mom, who had remained curiously silent through everything, but the message carried a symmetry too deliberate to ignore. I didn't respond. Some debts are best left undefined, especially the ones that bought your freedom. As I drove away, the lake reflected the last light of evening, its surface calm, its depths unreadable. For the first time in years, I felt no urge to explain myself to anyone. Power, I had learned, wasn't about speaking louder than those who laughed at you. It was about outlasting their echo. And as the road curved away from the restaurant, I realized that maybe victory doesn't sound like applause at all. Maybe it sounds like silence, earned, complete, and finally mine.